When Carol Dawson couldn't reach her mother, she thought Ruth had forgotten to charge her phone. She never imagined she would have to call the police. 83-year-old Ruth Dawson had vanished without telling her only daughter. The last people seen with her were two women everyone believed were her closest friends. Days later, Carol uncovered a terrifying truth. Her mother hadn't gone on a peaceful religious retreat. She had been isolated while a $3.9 million estate was quietly being signed away. But the courtroom uncovered something even more disturbing. Helen and Doris had allegedly done the same thing to 5 other elderly widows before Ruth. Stay with us until the very end, because today's story proves that the cruelest betrayals don't always come from family. Sometimes they come from the people who first convince you they are the family you were missing. Ruth Dawson was 83 years old and had lived in Atlanta, Georgia her entire life, working as a school administrator for 24 years before retiring in 2007. Her husband had passed in 2020, leaving her with a grief she had not been prepared for and an estate valued at $3.9 million. Her daughter, Carol, 46, managed her care and visited several times a week, grateful that Ruth had found companionship through 2 women she had met at her church grief support group, sisters named Helen Price, 68, and Doris Price, 65. Helen and Doris were warm, attentive, and consistently present in Ruth's life in ways that Carol had initially found reassuring. They attended church together, shared meals at Ruth's home, and called daily. Ruth described them as the closest friends she had made since her husband died. Carol had met them both and found nothing concerning. What Carol did not know was that Helen and Doris had identified Ruth through the grief support group with the specific intention of establishing exactly this kind of relationship. They had done it before. Investigators would later confirm they had done it 5 times. On a Tuesday morning in April of 2023, Carol called her mother and received no answer. She called again in the afternoon and again that evening. She drove to Ruth's home and found it empty. A neighbor told her Ruth had left 2 days earlier with 2 women and several bags, saying she was going on a short trip. Carol called Helen. The number went to voicemail. She called Doris, the same. She called the Atlanta Police Department that evening. Investigators located Ruth at a rural retreat property in northern Georgia that Helen had rented for 2 weeks. Ruth was physically unharmed, but visibly disoriented and deeply confused about how long she had been there. Her phone had been taken from her the first morning, with Helen explaining that the retreat required a digital detox. In the 4 days Ruth had been at the property, Helen and Doris had arranged for a mobile notary to visit. Ruth had signed a complete will revision, naming Helen as sole beneficiary of the full estate. Carol was not mentioned.
Investigators arrested Helen and Doris the same evening Ruth was found. Carol retained attorney Marcus Webb, a probate litigator in Atlanta. Marcus filed the will contest immediately and contacted the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, which had already received inquiries from families in 3 other counties describing nearly identical circumstances involving the same 2 women. The pattern was precise across all 6 cases: a grief support group, an extended friendship built over months, an isolated location where the target was separated from family and communication, a mobile notary arranged by Helen, a will revision executed during the isolation period. In 4 of the previous 5 cases, the families had contested the wills but had been unable to assemble sufficient evidence quickly enough to prevent partial asset transfers. Ruth's case was different because Carol had acted within 48 hours of her mother's disappearance. The hearing was held before the Honorable Judge Patricia Hayes at the Fulton County Superior Court. Marcus Webb presented Ruth's medical records, showing significant cognitive vulnerability. The
the retreat property rental records, the phone confiscation documented by Ruth's own account, the notary's visit log, and the GBI investigation connecting Helen and Doris to 5 prior cases across 3 counties. Marcus called Ruth to testify. She described being told the trip was a spiritual renewal weekend and arriving at a property where her phone was taken and where she was told the documents she signed were forms required by the retreat center. Helen's attorney argued Ruth had made a voluntary decision. Marcus Webb asked the court to consider what voluntary looked like when a woman's phone had been taken at arrival, when she had believed she was signing retreat paperwork, and when the same 2 women had executed the same sequence 5 times before with 5 other elderly widows. Judge Patricia Hayes ruled the will entirely invalid and referred both Helen and Doris Price to the Fulton County District Attorney for elder financial exploitation, criminal confinement, and conspiracy. The GBI investigation resulted in coordinated charges across multiple counties. Helen was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in Georgia State Prison. Doris was convicted as a co-conspirator and sentenced to 8 years. Both sentences reflected the court's finding that their conduct had been premeditated, organized, and repeated. Carol Dawson settled her mother's estate and accompanied Ruth to a new church community on the other side of Atlanta where no one knew Helen or Doris by name. Ruth told Carol she still wanted to make friends. Carol told her that was exactly right. She said she would simply be more careful about which ones she brought home for dinner. Would you have called the police as quickly as Carol did? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe to Court of Shadows for more courtroom drama stories every week.